Welcome to a fireside reading of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Chapter 52, Part 2. After some rubbing of the lower part of his face and some looking at us with those bad eyes over his grisly fingers, he made one more address to me, half whining and half abusive. "You think it justifiable, do you, Copperfield? You who pride yourself so much on your honour and all the rest of it, to sneak about my place, eavesdropping with my clerk? If it had been me, I shouldn't have wondered, for I don't make myself out a gentleman, though I never was in the streets either, as you were, according to Micawber. But being you, and you're not afraid of doing this either, you don't think at all of what I shall do in return, or of getting yourself into trouble for conspiracy and so forth. Very well. We shall see, Mr. What's your name? You are going to refer some question to Micawber. There's your referee. Why don't you make him speak? He has learned his lesson, I see." Seeing that what he said had no effect on me or any of us, he sat on the edge of his table with his hands in his pockets and one of his splay feet twisted round the other leg, waiting doggedly for what might follow. Mr. Micawber, whose impetuosity I had restrained thus far with the greatest difficulty, and who had repeatedly interposed with the first syllable of "scoundrel" without getting to the second, now burst forward, drew the ruler from his breast, apparently as a defensive weapon, and produced from his pocket a foolscap document folded in the form of a large letter. Opening this packet with his old flourish and glancing at the contents as if he cherished an artistic admiration of their style of composition, he began to read as follows. "Dear Miss Trotwood and gentlemen." "Bless and save the man," exclaimed my aunt in a low voice. "He'd write letters by the ream if it was a capital offence." Mr. Micawber, without hearing her, went on. "In appearing before you to denounce probably the most consummate villain that has ever existed," Mr. Micawber, without looking off the letter, pointed the ruler like a ghostly truncheon at Uriah Heep, "I ask no consideration for myself, the victim from my cradle of pecuniary liabilities to which I have been unable to respond. I have been the sport and toy of debasing circumstances. Ignominy, want, despair, and madness have collectively or separately been the attendants of my career." The relish with which Mr. Micawber described himself as a prey to these dismal calamities was only to be equalled by the emphasis with which he read his letter, and the kind of homage he rendered to it with a roll of his head when he thought he had hit a sentence very hard indeed. "In an accumulation of ignominy, want, despair, and madness, I entered the office, or as our lively neighbour the Gaul would term it, the bureau, of the firm nominally conducted under the appellation of Wickfield and Heap, but in reality wielded by Heap alone. Heap, and only Heap, is the mainspring of that machine. Heap, and only Heap, is the forger and the cheat. Uriah, more blue than white at these words, made a dart at the letter as if to tear it in pieces. Mr. Micawber, with a perfect miracle of dexterity or luck, caught his advancing knuckles with the ruler and disabled his right hand. It dropped at the wrist as if it were broken. The blow sounded as if it had fallen on wood. "The devil take you!" said Uriah, writhing in a new way with pain. "I'll be even with you." "Approach me again, you heap of infamy," gasped Mr. Micawber, "and if your head is human, I'll break it. Come on! Come on!" I think I never saw anything more ridiculous. I was sensible of it even at the time, than Mr. Micawber making broadsword guards with the ruler and crying, "Come on!" while Traddles and I pushed him back into a corner from which, as often as we got him into it, he persisted in emerging again. His enemy, muttering to himself after wringing his wounded hand for some time, slowly drew off his neckerchief and bound it up, then held it in his other hand and sat upon his table with his sullen face looking down. Mr. Micawber, when he was sufficiently cool, proceeded with his letter. "The stipendiary emoluments in consideration of which I entered into the service of Heap," always pausing before that word and uttering it with astonishing vigour, "were not defined beyond the pittance of 22 shillings and sixpence per week. The rest was left contingent on the value of my professional exertions, in other and more expressive words, on the baseness of my nature, the cupidity of my motives, the poverty of my family, the general moral, or rather immoral, resemblance between myself and Heap. Need I say that it soon became necessary for me to solicit from Heap pecuniary advances towards the support of Mrs. Micawber and our blighted but rising family? Need I say that this necessity had been foreseen by Heap? That those advances were secured by IOU and other similar acknowledgments known to the legal institutions of this country, and that I thus became enmeshed in the web he had spun for my reception. Mr. Micawber's enjoyment of his epistolary powers in describing this unfortunate state of things really seemed to outweigh any pain or anxiety that the reality could have caused him. He read on. Then it was that Heap began to favour me with just so much of his confidence as was necessary to the discharge of his infernal business. Then it was that I began, if I may so Shakespeareanly express myself, to dwindle, peak, and pine. I found that my services were constantly called into requisition for the falsification of business and the mystification of an individual whom I will designate as Mr. W. That Mr. W. was imposed upon, kept in ignorance, and deluded in every possible way, yet that all this while the ruffian Heap was professing unbounded gratitude to and unbounded friendship for that much abused gentleman. This was bad enough, but as the philosophic Dane observes, with that universal applicability which distinguishes the illustrious ornament of the Elizabethan era, worse remains behind. Mr. Micawber was so very much struck by this happy rounding off with a quotation that he indulged himself and us with a second reading of the sentence under the pretense of having lost his place. "It is not my intention," he continued reading on, "to enter on a detailed list within the compass of the present epistle, though it is ready elsewhere, of the various malpractices of a minor nature affecting the individual whom I have denominated Mr. W., to which I have been a tacitly consenting party. My object when the contest within myself between stipend and no stipend, baker and no baker, existence and non-existence ceased, was to take advantage of my opportunities to discover and expose the major malpractices committed to that gentleman's grievous wrong and injury by Heap, stimulated by the silent monitor within and by a no less touching and appealing monitor without, to whom I will briefly refer as Miss W. I entered on a not unlaborious task of clandestine investigation, protracted, now to the best of my knowledge, information, and belief, over a period exceeding 12 calendar months." He read this passage as if it were an act of Parliament and appeared majestically refreshed by the sound of the words. "My charges against Heap," he read on, glancing at him and drawing the ruler into a convenient position under his left arm in case of need, "are as follows." We all held our breath, I think. I am sure Uriah held his. "First," said Mr. Micawber, "when Mr. W.'s faculties and memory for business became, through causes into which it is not necessary or expedient for me to enter, weakened and confused, Heap designedly perplexed and complicated the whole of the official transactions. When Mr. W. was least fit to enter on business, Heap was always at hand to force him to enter on it. He obtained Mr. W.'s signature under such circumstances to documents of importance, representing them to be other documents of no importance. He induced Mr. W. to empower him to draw out thus one particular sum of trust money, amounting to 12, 6, 14, 2, and 9, and employed it to meet pretended business charges and deficiencies which were either already provided for or had never really existed. He gave this proceeding throughout the appearance of having originated in Mr. W.'s own dishonest intention and of having been accomplished by Mr. W.'s own dishonest act, and has used it ever since to torture and constrain him." "You shall prove this, you Copperfield," said Uriah with a threatening shake of the head. "Oh, all in good time." "Ask Heap, Mr. Traddles, who lived in his house after him," said Mr. Micawber, breaking off from the letter. "Will you?" "The fool himself, and lives there now," said Uriah disdainfully. "Ask Heap if he ever kept a pocket-book in that house," said Mr. Micawber. "Will you?" I saw Uriah's lank hand stop involuntarily in the scraping of his chin. Or ask him, said Mr. Micawber, if he ever burnt one there. If he says yes, and asks you where the ashes are, refer him to Wilkins Micawber, and he will hear of something not at all to his advantage. The triumphant flourish with which Mr. Micawber delivered himself of these words had a powerful effect in alarming the mother, who cried out in much agitation, "Uri, Uri, be humble and make terms, my dear." "Mother," he retorted, "you will keep quiet. You're in a fright and don't know what you say or mean. Humble," he repeated, looking at me with a snarl. "I've humbled some of them for a pretty long time, humble as I was." Mr. Micawber, genteelly adjusting his chin in his cravat, presently proceeded with his composition. "Second, Heap has on several occasions, to the best of my knowledge, information, and belief—" "But that won't do," muttered Uriah, relieved. "Mother, you keep quiet." "We will endeavour to provide something that will do, and do for you finally, sir, very shortly," replied Mr. Micawber. "Second, Heap has on several occasions, to the best of my knowledge, information, and belief, systematically forged to various entries, books, and documents the signature of Mr. W., and has distinctly done so in one instance, capable of proof by me, to wit, in manner following, that is to say—" Again, Mr. Micawber had a relish in this formal piling up of words, which, however ludicrously displayed in his case, was, I must say, not at all peculiar to him. I have observed it in the course of my life in numbers of men. It seems to me to be a general rule. In the taking of legal oaths, for instance, deponents seem to enjoy themselves mightily when they come to several good words in succession for the expression of one idea, as that they utterly detest, abominate, and abjure, or so forth. And the old anathemas were made relishing on the same principle. We talk about the tyranny of words, but we like to tyrannize over them too. We are fond of having a large, superfluous establishment of words to wait upon us on great occasions. We think it looks important and sounds well. As we are not particular about the meaning of our liveries on state occasions, if they be but fine and numerous enough, so the meaning or necessity of our words is a secondary consideration, if there be but a great parade of them. And as individuals get into trouble by making too great a show of liveries, or as slaves, when they are too numerous, rise against their masters, so I think I could mention a nation that has got into many great difficulties, and will get into many greater, from maintaining too large a retinue of words. Mr. Micawber read on, almost smacking his lips. To wit, in manner following, that is to say, Mr. W., being infirm, and it being within the bounds of probability that his decease might lead to some discoveries, and to the downfall of Heap's power over the W. family, as I, Wilkins Micawber, the undersigned, assume, unless the filial affection of his daughter could be secretly influenced from allowing any investigation of the partnership affairs to ever be made, the said Heap deemed it expedient to have a bond ready by him as from Mr. W. for the before-mentioned sum of 12, 6, 14, 2, and 9, with interest, stated therein to have been advanced by to Mr. W. to save Mr. W. from dishonour, though really the sum was never advanced by him and has long been replaced. The signatures to this instrument purporting to be executed by Mr. W. and attested by Wilkins Micawber are forgeries by I have in my possession in his hand and pocketbook several similar imitations of Mr. W.'s signature, here and there defaced by fire, but legible to anyone. I never attested any such document, and I have the document itself in my possession. Uriah Heep, with a start, took out of his pocket a bunch of keys and opened a certain drawer, then suddenly bethought himself of what he was about and turned again towards us without looking in it. "And I have the document," Mr. Micawber read again, looking about as if it were the text of a sermon, "in my possession. That is to say, I had early this morning when this was written, but have since relinquished it to Mr. Traddles." "It is quite true," assented Traddles. Uri, cried the mother, "be humble and make terms. I know my son will be humble, gentlemen, if you'll give him time to think. Mr. Copperfield, I'm sure you know that he was always very humble, sir." It was singular to see how the mother still held to the old trick when the son had abandoned it as useless. "Mother," he said, with an impatient bite at the handkerchief in which his hand was wrapped, "you had better take and fire a loaded gun at me." "But I love you, Uri," cried Mrs. Heep, and I had no doubt she did, or that he loved her, however strange it may appear, though to be sure they were a congenial couple. "And I can't bear to hear you provoking the gentleman and endangering of yourself more. I told the gentleman at first, when he told me upstairs it was come to light, that I would answer for your being humble and making amends. Oh, see how humble I am, gentlemen, and don't mind him." "Why, there's Copperfield, mother," he angrily retorted, pointing his lean finger at me, against whom all his animosity was levelled as the prime mover in his discovery. And I did not undeceive him. "There's Copperfield. Would have given you £100 to say less than you've blurted out." "I can't help it, Uri," cried his mother. "I can't see you running into danger through carrying your head so high. Better be humble, as you always was." He remained for a little, biting the handkerchief, and then said to me with a scowl, "What more have you got to bring forward? If anything, go on with it. What do you look at me for?" Mr. Micawber promptly resumed his letter, glad to revert to a performance with which he was so highly satisfied. "Third and last, I am now in a condition to show by false books and real memoranda, beginning with the partially destroyed pocketbook, which I was unable to comprehend at the time of its accidental discovery by Mrs. Micawber on our taking possession of the present abode, in the locker or bin devoted to the reception of the ashes calcined on our domestic hearth. that the weaknesses, the faults, the very virtues, the parental affections, and the sense of honor of the unhappy Mr. W. have been for years acted on by and warped to the base purposes of heap, that Mr. W. has been for years deluded and plundered in every conceivable manner to the pecuniary aggrandizement of the avaricious, false, and grasping heap, that the engrossing object of heap was next to gain, to subdue Mr. and Miss W. Of his ulterior views in reference to the latter, I say nothing, entirely to himself, that his last act, completed but a few months since, was to induce Mr. W. to execute a relinquishment of his share in the partnership and even a bill of sale on the very furniture of this house, in consideration of a certain annuity to be well and truly paid by heap on the 4 common quarter days in each and every year, that these meshes, beginning with alarming and falsified accounts of the estate of which Mr. W. is the receiver, at a period when Mr. W. had launched into imprudent and ill-judged speculations, and may not have had the money for which he was morally and legally responsible in hand, going on with pretended borrowings of money at enormous interest, really coming from and by fraudulently obtained or withheld from Mr. W. himself on pretense of such speculations, or otherwise perpetuated by a miscellaneous catalogue of unscrupulous chicaneries, gradually thickened until the unhappy Mr. W. could see no world beyond, bankrupt, as he believed, alike in circumstances, in all other hope, and in honor. His sole reliance was upon the monster in the garb of man. Mr. Micawber made a good deal of this as a new turn of expression. Who, by making himself necessary to him, had achieved his destruction. All this I undertake to show, probably much more. I whispered to Agnes a few words, who was weeping, half joyfully, half sorrowfully at my side, and there was a movement among us as if Mr. Micawber had finished. He said with exceeding gravity, "Pardon me," and proceeded with a mixture of the lowest spirits and the most intense enjoyment to the peroration of his letter. "I have now concluded. It merely remains for me to substantiate these accusations, and then, with my ill-starred family, to disappear from the landscape on which we appear to be an encumbrance. That is soon done. It may be reasonably inferred that our baby will first expire of inanition, as being the frailest member of our circle, and that our twins will follow next in order. So be it. For myself, my Canterbury pilgrimage has done much. Imprisonment on civil process and want will soon do more. I trust that the labor and hazard of an investigation, of which the smallest results have been slowly pieced together in the pressure of arduous avocations, under grinding, penurious apprehensions, at rise of morn, at dewy eve, in the shadows of night, under the watchful eye of one whom it were superfluous to call demon, combined with the struggle of parental poverty to turn it, when completed, to the right account, may be as the sprinkling of a few drops of sweet water on my funeral pyre. I ask no more. Let it be in justice merely said of me as of a gallant and eminent naval hero, with whom I have no pretensions to cope, that what I have done I did in despite of mercenary and selfish objects for England, home, and beauty, remaining always, and cetera, a Wilkins Micawber. Thanks all for joining me. Same again tomorrow, same time and place. 5 Pacific at Fireside Reading on Instagram. All chapters uploaded to the YouTube channel Fireside Reading. I won't be reading on Friday, but on Thursday, tomorrow, yes. Let's finish this chapter tomorrow, which we will. Look forward to seeing you all, but until then, please stay very well. Good night.